Common house, student house.
Right. I think it's my turn. I have to start.
Hello, everybody. My name is Ebru Kaya. I work as a library director at Bilkent University Library. I'm very glad to see all of you here, actually. Dear faculty members, dear students, and dear guests. All of you, welcome to the Bilkent University Library Lunchtime Lecture Series. And library lectures, which are carried out by bringing together in the library lecturers expert in their own fields and the Bilkent members. Each talk in the series will be delivered by specialists about their academic research or experience, but aimed at non-specialist audience. The first, I would like to mention here our first speaker. The first library lecture was entitled Shakespeare III, performed by its Professor Talat Halman. It was held on March 2008. David knows very well, actually. The project was started with David Thornton, actually. I'm glad to see him here today also, thanks to him starting such a lovely lunchtime lectures in the library. We remember him, we remember Talat Hoca with respect today, and we come together here for the first lecture of this semester. I am very glad to have Professor Olsen here, again from the same faculty actually, after many years. I would like to give a little bit information about Professor Olsen. Professor Olsen is head of the Department of English Language and Literature and acting dean of the Faculty of Humanities and Letters at Bilkent University. He was formerly the pro-rector of Oxford University College, Norway, and has held chairs in English, comparative literature, and philosophy at the universities of Olsen and Bergen, and at Lingnan University, Hong Kong. His books include Structure of the Literary Understanding, The End of Literary Theory, and Truth, Fiction and Literature. These are his books. He is at the moment in the process of completing a book on critical concept of critical instruments. In his talk, Professor Olsen will talk about the challenges of developing a concept of humanistic studies by defining a number of criteria that together will yield a clear and critically useful concept. Now, I would like to keep it very short. I would like to say again, all of you welcome. Hopefully, each semester we will have lunchtime lecture series in the library again. And I would like to invite him now to stage for his speech, please, Professor Olsen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks for inviting me. And I understand this is the first lecture for some time, so if I'm very disappointing, there won't be anyone here next time. It's rather a bit of pressure in that one, actually, or as the Chinese say, a bit of pleasure. Now, I thought that maybe since I actually just started as the acting dean of the Humanities faculty, or the Faculty of Humanities and Letters, that would be a suitable topic. Of course, my abstract promises too much. It promises to give criteria that will give us the possibility of, shall we say, chart a course for the faculty. Of course, the second part of my title was the first was what are the humanities at Bilkent and other places, and where are they going, and that means the humanities at Bilkent. I'll see if I can extract something from this. Of course, where we're going depends not merely on my definition, but it also depends on university policy to a very great extent. So that may be a promissory note, but let's see what comes out of it. I'll try to stick to my time, which is it's about 40. Well, I'll keep an eye on the watch. Try not to bore you too long. Now, two questions that you meet as a worker in the field of humanities. One is the definition. What is it? And recent discussions about the value and nature of the humanities tend to proceed as if it's unproblematic to assume that there's a group of studies that can meaningfully be called humanistic. So I'm going to use the term humanistic studies, humanities, synonymously. Now, the discussions proceed on the basis of what I would call a nominalist definition of the humanities. That is, they accept that the humanities are what educators, administrators, and politicians have chosen to label humanities. Of course, that's a simple way of identifying the humanities. Now, problematic aspect of this is that there is no discussion of the requirements that the concept of humanities or humanistic studies have to fulfill to function as a clear and fruitful critical instrument, enabling the critic to distinguish a class of studies that has some common core that makes the notion of humanistic appropriate to them. Now that, of course, escapes the nominalist definition because it looks at the humanities from the outside. It's interesting, of course, that a nominalistic definition is what's used in educational research. There is a woman called Jane Donnell, I mustn't get the Mac in there, Jane Donnell, who's doing, she's doing research on education, and she's looking at what you learn in various disciplines, and when she goes to a discipline, she simply accepts what there is, and she looks at what they are doing. My argument, of course, that we can't do this, and I don't want to do it as the Dean of the Humanities faculty, because the nominalist definition, it really constitutes an abdication of theoretical responsibility. And I think that in the humanities we have the responsibility for taking a stand, if you want. That sounds dreadful, as if you have to take a stand, but you have to define a concept at least so that we know what we are doing or what we should be doing. Now, I want, as I said in the abstract, to take up the challenge of developing a concept of humanistic studies by defining, and I see that I said a number of criteria that together will yield a clear and critically useful concept. Actually, there will just be two criteria. You keep them to a minimum. Now, the thing is, of course, that such a concept does not, or the definition that I'm going to give, and that I think we need, does not necessarily cover all the subjects that we find in the humanities faculty at Bilkent or in other places. And so by throwing out a definition that is in its nature essentialist and normative, I will be stepping on some toes. I don't know if anyone here has got sore toes, but I might. But we will get to that in the end. Now, one of the requirements to such a concept, and a requirement that I'm not going to say all that much about, is that it must give to the concept a historical pedigree. You don't just want to link together humanistic studies as we find them at Bilkent, but you also want to give them a pedigree, that is to be able to trace the concept back in history and give what I shall call thickness to the concept. And this will confer cultural significance on the concept and make the notion, and we'll see how the notion of humanistic is appropriate to the studies that we are engaged in. Water break. Now, That's one question. Maybe it's a simple one, maybe it's the simplest one. But there's a second question, and I don't think I'm going to have time today to say very much about that, though we'll see. And that is, are such studies, and I say studies, are such studies as we can meaningfully call humanistic, are they modern disciplines of knowledge? That, of course, is something that we face every day when we're in competition for funds, for example. This is a running problem for the humanities. Now, the problem here is that you can use the term discipline loosely, and of course, in that loose sense, all the humanistic studies are humanistic disciplines. But of course, in the 19th century, there was a development of a new concept of discipline, academic discipline of knowledge, which came into being from the beginning 1800 roughly, with Humboldt's reformation of the University of Berlin. This is when we get the start of the modern academic disciplines. And the point about modern academic disciplines is, of course, that they impose a number of constraints on you. And these constraints, I normally, when I speak to my students, I talk about a paradigm or a matrix that we have to follow in order to come to conclusions that are acceptable within the discipline. So a disciplinary matrix. And such a disciplinary matrix, you can see it developing in the discipline of history, where at the same time as we get a start of the historical discipline at the beginning of the 19th century, a little later, about 50, 60 years later, we get books on how to do historiography. And there are 3 or 4 I could mention in Germany, there are at least 2 in France, and by the 1920s you also get Acton in English writing manuals on how to do history. Today, of course, there are dime a dozen these manuals on how to do history. And it was the first manual of how to do sociology came in 1895, I think. The methods of sociology. Who was it that founded the department at Bordeaux? Anyway, I get off the track here. Now, because the disciplines that we refer to as humanistic, are they really disciplines of knowledge in this new sense that developed in the 19th century? Now, there has been a tendency in the humanities to de-emphasize the difference between the social sciences and the humanities. Now, by giving the sort of definition that I'm going to give, I'm going to re-emphasize the distinction between the social sciences and the humanities, and I'm also going to introduce a distinction between 2 different kinds of discipline in the humanities. I think you can draw a distinction between what you can call disciplines of understanding and disciplines of appreciation in the humanities. There are 2 disciplines, at least, in the humanities that are concerned with, shall we say, aesthetic judgment, art history and literature. There are several disciplines concerned with understanding. I'm thinking of history, I'm thinking of linguistics, of various types of linguistics. And I think these 2 kinds of disciplines have different epistemologies. And by that I mean that understanding is one form of apprehension, appreciation that we practice in relation to literary works and works of art is another mode of apprehension, and the criteria for when they're successful are different, and the role of the interpreter, if you want, are different in the 2. I have to watch my time here. Very often get okay. Now, so I don't think I'll get to that argument today, but if I do, I will argue for a division within the humanities in addition to the division between social sciences and the humanities. So where do we start if we don't make use of a nominalistic definition? It's very usual to start this discussion in the humanities by talking about the effects or the ends, if you want, of studying humanities subjects. May I also say that it's not, I mean, I'm now trying to get a definition of, a meaningful definition of a group of studies that belong together, but not everyone that belong together and where we can meaningfully apply the term humanistic, but not everyone agrees that it's possible to delimit such a group. For example, and then the question is what you do if you can't delimit a group of humanistic studies. Most of you may have heard the name Jonathan Culler, and of course Culler doesn't believe that it's possible to have a group of disciplines called humanistic. So he says this, that the major advances in knowledge in the humanities in modernity have generally come from theoretical projects that have declined to take human intentions and purposes at face value as satisfactory explanations and have sought instead to look deeper, to more pervasive trans-individual structures and forces, in the process treating explicit intentions as phenomena that may offer obfuscation as much as explanation. Now, because the forms of inquiry that take as their aim, and I quote again, to look deeper, to more pervasive trans-individual structures and forces, would be seen by many academics as being, as Jeffrey Haugom has said, not legitimately of the humanities. Not legitimately of the humanities. Because these theories are reductive, but I'll come back to that. Now, for myself, well, Jonathan Culler, he issues an invitation. He says, why don't we do, we should do away with the name humanities and find a more suitable name for disciplines and for these disciplines, because the notion of humanities invites sort of misleading ideology, or it invites us to assume a misleading ideology. Now, for my part, of course, I reject the invitation, and this was, Jonathan Culler made this invitation to change the name of the humanities in 2005, and I don't think it's made much impact in the sense that we're still talking about the humanities. But it does put its finger on something that's very important for the humanities. I'll come back to that also in a minute. Now, of course, Jonathan Culler, what he wants is not, this is not really a recommendation to change a name. It's a recommendation to stop doing what we're doing and start doing something else. He makes a familiar sort of rhetorical ploy where he says that he's trying to clarify a concept, but really what he's trying to do is to make us start doing something else, or go home and let someone else do something else, which is very often, of course, what this is about. Okay then, what is the nature of humanistic discipline? How can we approach them? How can we distinguish between humanistic disciplines and other kinds of disciplines? Now, standard way of doing this is to try to identify a number of ends that humanistic disciplines serve. If you go back into the history of liberal studies, then you find that there is an array of confusing claims made for the ends of humanistic studies. And this actually goes through the whole tradition, at least back to the Renaissance. I rely a lot in my lecture here on Ronald Crane. I always found he's got a very clear mind. He wrote in beginning of the 1960s a book called The Idea of the Humanities. It's 2 volumes, so I only rely on the first article of 15 pages actually. That must be enough. But he says that the humanities have been looked upon as means to the realization of some large ideal over and above the understanding and appreciation of whatever specific subject matters they have been thought to consist in. And Crane lists a number of ends that different philosophers in different periods have seen the humanities as serving. For example, they restore man to humanity and raise him towards God. They lead to the knowledge of man's self. They induce a philosophic habit of mind. They lead to a harmonious expansion and interrelation of all the powers which make the beauty and worth of human nature, etc., etc. And of course, recently we've had some very strident claims made for the humanities, and of course I only need to mention Martha Nussbaum. Even the title of the books, you get this reference. I'm thinking of Not for Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. Of course, you know, it's a tad overstated, I think, but this was relatively recent. It was 2010 that the book came out the first time. Now, the problem with defining the humanities in terms of the large and noble purposes which they may be supposed to serve is that there is a persistent vagueness in these claims about what people actually do in the humanities. One thing, you have the large and noble ends, then you go into the classroom to try to serve the large and noble ends, and of course you find that it's, what is it called? What do we write? Aims and objectives of courses, which is a bit way off from the large and noble ends. And we've all been, you know, fighting to find these course objectives, or to formulate them. What I want to say is that this is not a new problem. In fact, this has been a problem that's been persistent in the humanities since the Renaissance. There is a book by Lisa Jardine and Anthony Grafton, where they go through a lot of class material from the Renaissance, and they compare that to statements by the humanities educators about what they're actually doing. And of course, you know, still you have the large and lofty ends on the one hand, about educating citizens, etc. And then, of course, the class material turns out to be sort of Latin exercises, very specific exercises. And the relationship between the two is rather problematic, to put it like that. Now, we of course all have experienced, I hope, that sort of tension. Now, that is one of the objections to using ends as defining the humanities. Now, if you go through, I'm not going to go through the history and show what people have said about this kind of education. It's perhaps particularly interesting to read Cardinal Newman, or when, you know, he founded this Catholic university in Dublin, and he writes very well, and he tells us all that this wonderful education is going to do. And of course, then we have we have Stephen Collini's remark on this marvelous passage, because it's a marvelous passage. You know, Cardinal Newman, he writes very well. his prose flows very well, it's rhythmical. And Chiellini, he says, one ungenerous response to such a paragraph, that such a paragraph might provoke, is the thought that something this wonderful liberal education does not teach seems to be a sense of proportion in justifying oneself. So the point is that, again, you have this statement of general goals, and there is a distance to the classroom. Now, the underlying problem here, of course, is a problem of contingency. The relationship between means and end is contingent. That is, there's no logical connection here between means and end. It's an empirical connection. You have to do empirical research to see if the humanities really serve these ends. Now, one question. If the end, let's take one of these grand goals, is to get to know oneself, then an hour on the couch on the psychiatrist might actually be better spent than 3 months studying the French Revolution. Even more problematic is that the humanizing influence of humanistic studies may turn out, in fact, to be non-existent, given that the connection between means and ends is contingent. It's an empirical question whether the means actually bring about the desired end. And again, the argument has been made that people steeped in humanistic studies can be nasty, immoral, and cruel, both in private and public capacities. And of course, I mean, most of us, well, at least quite a few of us have worked in humanistic departments for quite some time in our lives, and I have worked in humanities department in 4 or 5 different institutions, and my experience is these people actually not a bit better than other people. In fact, they may even be worse in the sort of infighting you get in humanities department. But that, of course, is anecdotal evidence, but it's worth something for me. All right. Now, so the ends definition is not very promising. And also, it leads to strife, you know, but let's leave that aside. I'm going to suggest a more fruitful point of departure, I hope. But it's not down to me. It's Crane that suggested it. And he suggests that we take our point of departure in the fact that humanistic studies are studies. You know, they are studies of aspects of human experience, he says. And they are those disciplines that deal with the aspects of human experience that make us most human and therefore differentiates us from the animals. In other words, he is not focusing on the ends, but he's switching focus to the means. That is, the area of study are the areas of study that are the areas that makes us most different from the animals. Now, it's interesting here that he contrasts human not with non-human or inhuman, but with animal. Thus, he avoids a very standard association between human, as in humanities, and humane. That is, I think that's an important point. Now, then I suggested, I wrote up a Dean's statement, and I suggested that central to these aspects of human experience is the ability of man to express himself in unique and unpredictable ways, in ways that in the end form our culture, and express himself not only in language but also in objects, that is in art objects or in cultural objects. And all of these, of course, we study in literature, we study in archaeology, we don't study in art because we don't have a course in art, but it's one of the humanistic disciplines. Now, so we have an object of study then for the humanities, but that doesn't really help us all that much, because important is also the aim and the method. The humanities aim at an understanding or at an appreciation and use of the objects that it studies that specifies their character as human expressions. That is, it studies these objects not as an exemplum of many, but study them as unique. You don't study Hamlet to find out how similar it is to Pride and Prejudice, or how different it is from Pride and Prejudice. You study Hamlet in order to understand Hamlet, to appreciate Hamlet. Myself, I'm in a literature department, and of course the whole tenor of much of our classes, because we teach literature to foreign students, is to initiate them into how can they access this particular object, and how can they find out why it is worth appreciating and how to appreciate it. So the focus is on the single object. So this kind of definition of the humanities, you have a field of studies specified in general terms, then you have a specific approach or aim and understanding and appreciation and use of the objects that will most completely preserve the unique character. Now notice that neither of these elements refer to a set of disciplines. They don't. But central to both elements is the notion of the specifically human character of the object of study. And the human here, we should remember again, the contrast is not inhuman, non-human, but actually animal. That is, they are the sort of objects or acts or expressions that can't be subsumed under general laws if you want to understand them. Now, it's quite usual in the when you discuss the humanities to distinguish between, you say that humanities, sorry, just have to do this sometime. Humanities actually leads to an understanding of the object, while sciences provides us with an explanation. It's not a very clear distinction, I don't particularly like it, but there is something about that. It's in particular useful, I think, to introduce another concept than understanding in connection with the humanities, and that is the concept of apprehension. That is, apprehension as a general epistemic term, and then you have understanding as a subclass of that, and you have appreciation as a subclass of that, but the two have different epistemologies. And by that I mean that in trying to appreciate a work of art, what enters into your approach to it is an attempt to identify some sort of value. This is not necessarily if you try to understand a historical phenomenon, for example. Now, I hope, and I think, that this concept of humanistic study is not a revolutionary one. It leads to roughly what we have today, but it will enable us to draw a principal distinction between humanistic studies and studies that do not belong under this concept. And this is where, of course, one might start treading on toes, because it's quite obvious that within the humanities we have a number of practices that are reductive in their nature, but they still work in the same departments as we do. And one of the things that attracted me to Bilkent, I must say, was that at least the department I'm in the English department, this wasn't a very dominant approach, actually. The focus was on British literature, the single work, etc. You could have various approaches, but all of them were aimed at teaching the students how to access that particular object. Now, the concept, this concept, as I've suggested, can be given legitimacy not by merely by binding together a number of subjects. It does that, but also because it belongs to a discourse universe that goes back 2,200 years, 2,000 years. Well, we're 2,100 now, so it goes back to the Studia Humanitatis, to the Paideia in ancient Greece. So it has a long pedigree, and not only that, but the pedigree is formulated, the pedigree is secured, you should say, by the discourse universe. That is, the terms that we use to talk about the humanities, that's been around for 2,000 years, that vocabulary. It has transformed from one period to the next, but it's still the way in which we formulate problems. It's typical in literary studies, where the shall I say, the formulation of the problems in literary criticism are due to 4 works in antiquity. It's Plato, it's Aristotle, it's Horace, and it's Longinus. Those 4 works set the framework in which we still discuss much literature, if we discuss them in humanistic terms. Okay. Now, then of course we come to the practical question: what are the fields that fulfill these requirements? Again, no surprises. If we're talking about the uniqueness of human expression, of course, the main form of human expression is language. So it's the study of language that is central to the humanities. It's always been central to the humanities. If we go back to some of the foundational works in humanities scholarship, and I'm thinking, for example, of Lorenzo Valle's criticism of the Constantine donation. I don't know if you know that. Should I do a brief one on Constantine? No. But the point is that in that work, when he proved that the Constantine donation was a forgery, he used philological knowledge, and he used the idea that the past is different from the present to show that this couldn't have been written in the 4th century. Probably, most probably, it was written in the 8th century. Language and the idea of the development of language was central in his criticism of the Constantine donation. And that's an exemplary and one of the first examples of humanistic scholarship. Okay, let's return to the question. What are the disciplines that fall under this definition? Language, yes, and then of course other forms of expression, artistic expression, cultural expression. In fact, architecture would also fall under this. architecture has many other aspects as well. Then, of course, expression of ideas and the formulations of systems of thought, philosophy. Then, of course, artistic criticism, or not, maybe it's wrong to say artistic criticism, but the examples I have given has been of the sort of instruments we develop in order to grasp what very abstractly you can call the aesthetic structures that man produces. One of the things that we do in literature is we develop, or we ask the students to develop a vocabulary, so, you know, we give them instruments that will enable them to have access to these objects that we present them with. Now, what does this mean for? There was a promise about what are we going with the humanities at Bilkent in this title. I think that this, of course, is not in any way a new or revolutionary concept of what humanities disciplines are, but it does give us some pointers. One of the pointers, of course, is to should we say, an expansion of the humanities, in the sense that humanities at Bilkent, we have literature, we have archaeology, so we have aesthetic disciplines, we have history, but it doesn't belong in the humanities faculty. And we have philosophy, but we don't have any art history. So if you want to expand into a full humanities faculty, then humanities need to add a few, shall we say, subjects. Now, why do we need to add that? Couldn't we just go on and just study literature in isolation, history in isolation, or archaeology in isolation? The reason, of course, is that these are independent. The humanities disciplines do have a pretty strong interdependence. So one of the things that we just introduced in the English department was a history course, because there is such a lot of English literature you can't really understand without understanding the history. I mean, just the other day we were talking about the value of income in Jane Austen and how they relate to the moral scheme of the novel. You can't understand Jane Austen if you don't understand the value of incomes. And if you don't understand that Jane Austen was calculating with 2.5% when she wrote her books. And there is an interrelation here between history and literature. There is an interrelationship between language, linguistics, and literature, undoubtedly. Again, you can illustrate this if you look at different cultures again. If you look at English literature and you read about the church, you have to know about the hierarchy of the church. It's quite different from, and I'm Norwegian, from Norwegian. So there is an interdependence between the two. And of course, if you study or work with works from the decadence, it's quite useful to have art history, and this actually applies to any period, to be able to cross-reference with works of art. So, yes, there's an argument for expanding the number of subjects in Bilkent, in the Faculty of Humanities and Letters. Where do we go? What other pointers does this definition of the humanities as the good arts Where does it lead us? Well, it does lead us to distinguish between certain types of activity, that is, reductive and non-reductive activities. And this is, of course, as I said, I haven't seen much of it in Bilkent, but I've seen in other universities where actually you get a focus that reduces literature to a symptom of some kind. The obvious example, of course, is dedicated psychoanalytic analysis of literature, or dedicated Marxist. There's a difference between, just run-of-the-mill Marxist and dedicated Marxist here. The same in psychoanalysis. So that is a sort of distinction that this kind of definition will lead us to draw, actually. I see that I'm getting close to the end of my time. Don't want to step on any more toes today, but you can see this, you can see where the line goes, so to speak. Two words about my second, or the second element that I mentioned in the abstract, and that is the notion of academic disciplines. And I'm talking about academic disciplines of knowledge. Are humanities or humanistic studies, can they be constituted as academic disciplines of knowledge? I'm going to leave you with the question, but let me say a few words about it, because this is something that I've been struggling with for quite a long time. And I'm struggling with it because I'm in literary studies, and literary studies has a long tradition of struggling with this. This goes back to, and I have to take the tradition that I know myself, the English tradition, where in the 19th century and up to the very end of the century, you have a struggle going on to get modern literature accepted as a discipline in the universities. And this has been well documented. There is a long struggle in the 1880s to get English into the university, into Oxford University. And funnily enough, it's the historians who've just been accepted at that time as an academic discipline, and there are reasons why. They are against admitting literature. And the reason, of course, is that the aesthetic disciplines in the humanities, they rest on what's ultimately a core of subjectivity. You can't do away with the notion of taste or some sort of, shall we say, concept of the subjective nature of the judgment on literature or on art. This is really, and I'll stop in a moment, this is really a very sort of basic point, and it's not a surprising point. Taste was conceived as an internal, it was conceived parallel to physical taste. It's a sort of mental ability that you had. And of course, this is true in the appreciation of many arts, that you actually have physical or mental abilities that is necessary for you to grasp a work of art. I don't, I'm totally unmusical. I'm not, well, maybe I'm tone deaf. My daughter has absolute pitch. There is a difference in my ability to appreciate music and her ability to appreciate music. There's always, and this is subjective, something I can do about that one. And so I'm just trying to illustrate that this thing about the subjective core is not sort of radical subjectivism of any kind. but it is something that we carry with us. I mean, some people have a greater ability for artistic perception in various ways. I mean, if you're colorblind, obviously you're handicapped, but that's all I wanted to say. This is the problem with the subjectivity of the aesthetic disciplines within the humanities. Okay, thank you, thank you. Yes, any questions? I promise, yes.
About subjectivity. Historians may look down on literary people.
Yes, they did.
Accusing them of being subjective. But history too is subjective to a great extent because you have documents and you have to interpret.
Yes, yes,
yes. The fundamental subjectivity is there. There's hardly any difference between writing a novel and writing this book of history.
That's very interesting because I'm writing a paper on that. And of course, there is a difference between Macaulay's History of England and the sort of papers. I mean, that was 1960s, wasn't it? And then the sort of history that is written after, towards the end of the century, by Maitland and people like that.
But this goes back to Fielding.
Yeah, yeah.
Who claims that the reality of truth of fiction is higher than the truth of history because history deals with certain people.
Well, yeah, sure.
With certain incidents that happened at a certain place, whereas his Aristotelian his concept of it.
Well, that is that.
Literature deals with the generals.
Yes. Yeah, no, I mean...
That makes quite a lot of sense to me.
Yes, it does. Once upon a time, when I was young, or younger than today, I wrote a book with Peter Lamar called Truth, Fiction and Literature, where we deal in some detail with this sort of thing. Yeah. No, it's an interesting point. What is truth in this connection?
If you're doing philosophical arguments, then you would be nowhere at all.
Yeah.
Subjective.
Well, true.
Thank you so much.
Was it okay?
Yeah, of course, it was wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, thank you for coming.
I'm older than you.